Today we will discuss modernist poetry. In our last two sessions, we talked about war poetry and the term modernism as a cultural movement. Looking up at the features of modernist poetry, we see that modern poets they used allusions and myths, especially from the non-Western traditions. We also see that their poetry is non-linear and fragmented. And this is a very important trait that signifies or represents modernism or modernity. We also see that symbolism was used in some cases, not very popular and not very frequent. As talked earlier, we know that modernist age or modernist movement it was highly influenced by various movements like Imagism, Vorticism, Surrealism, Objectivism, Expressionism, Cubism. And as discussed in our last session, we will take up these terms individually later on in our coming sessions. We see that there was an extensive use of collage, and mosaic and collage was a very popular medium or a tool used by modernist poets. We know that metropolitan or city based poetry or art is popular, and metropolitan in theme and setting was an important feature of modernist poetry. Subjective consciousness was explored in modernist poetry. We also see that the poets were obsessed with the ruined civilization of the 20th century and some kind of a destruction, devastation happening out of the wars, and the ruined civilization and a hope for regeneration has been depicted in their poetry. We see that there was an experimentation with form and style. And among the experimentation, visual poetry is one such area or variety where the typeface itself was non-linear and it was arranged differently. When we look up at the poetry of poets like Cummings or Ezra Pound or Bob Cobbing, we see that they made use of this visual poetry in a very efficient manner. There was also some kind of a political poetry from poets like Spender and Auden. And as discussed many a times, we see that numerous movements in poetry were seen. And some of these movements had their own manifestos. Because we know that modernist poetry in England was, say, highly influenced by French symbolism. And we have big names here like Rimbaud, Lafarge, Malam, Balderley, and the American Insights of Ezra Pound. And T.S. Eliot, in this sense, is considered to be the most or the best representative of modernist poetry who moved from the US to England. We will discuss expressionism here because, as a movement, we will take up these movements one by one. Before discussing another features, we'll take up expressionism, which was a movement in the modern art, which came first into prominence among the German artists, who were highly influenced by the work of Van Gogh and Edvard Munch. There were two main groups in Germany. One was the Bridge, which was formed in 1905, and one was the Blue Rider, which was formed in 1911. Expressionism as a movement believed in using violent colors and dynamic movements to capture moods. And it was abstract in the sense because the painting was difficult to decode and understand. Even the patterns and colors could not be decoded because they did not necessarily reflected the theme that the colors or the abstractness reflected. Uh, Here we need to mention the name of Bertolt Brecht, who was a dramatist or a playwright, and he was highly influenced by this movement called Expressionism. And in Britain, there was one writer, Wyndham Lewis, who adapted the methods of modernism, and he created a new movement called Vorticism in England by another name. And we will take up this Vorticism in our next sessions, as and when we take up individual poets. Second movement that we quickly take up today is Imagism. Uh, it is a movement which emphasized form above everything else. Form was very important for them. It requires the poet to remove himself from the poem and deliver it as objectively as possible. So, the poem should be had should have no extra flourishes or ornamentations. All adjectives and descriptives were to be avoided completely. No abstractions had to be used. Words had to be very accurate and precise in their meanings. The poetry was very hard and clear, and because it was the Imagist Manifesto. So, according to the Imagist Manifesto, they said that the poetry had to be hard and clear, and images, they were supposed to capture emotions and events in an instead of time. Instead of time is the phrase given by the manifesto. The names which are associated with this movement called Imagism is Ezra Pound, T. Hume, Robinson, Amy Lowell, Hilda Doolittle, F.S. Flint, etc. And these were the poets who formulated this aesthetic called Imagism. And we also have some Imagist anthologies separately published by these writers, four published Imagist anthologies.